Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Authentic Assessment of Civic Readiness, the Challenges of Implementation. This event is a part of Democracy Ready New York Coalition's New York Civic Learning Week webinar series.
Good evening. I'm Michael Rebell. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College, Columbia University, and we are the conveners of Democracy Ready New York. As you know, Democracy Ready is a coalition you may not have known, actually, is a coalition of education organizations and civic organizations in the state of New York that are dedicated to promoting civic education. And Democracy Ready is also an active member of Civics Now, which is a project of iCivics. So happy to have all of you with us tonight. Tonight's webinar and its topic are an outgrowth of a report that Democracy Ready issued a couple of months ago, which was an overview of the state of civic assessment throughout the United States. And the conclusion of our report was that the state of civic assessment, unfortunately, is quite poor in the United States. Now, civic assessment is a critical part of civic education because you all know the old adage, what gets tested is what gets taught. And if we're going to promote more civic education, better civic education, we need to prioritize that civic assessment, which is a central aspect of people understanding and prioritizing civic education. Let me just give you a very brief summary of what our findings were in this report. There are 21 states in the United States that barely assess civics at all. They do it, if they do it, through taking a limited number of questions from the naturalization exam. Now, the naturalization exam is a test that the naturalization bureaus give to new American citizens, and they have a bank of about 100 multiple choice questions. They ask the test takers to answer correctly 6 out of 10 of those questions. Many states have picked that up and only ask their students to answer 6 out of 10 multiple choice questions. In most of these states, the students can see the questions in advance. Some states ask them to answer a few more of the questions. But the point is, this is a very limited domain. It's a very limited amount of knowledge that can be covered by these short multiple choice questions. And many scholars in the area say that this test not only has little value, but it may indeed be counterproductive because educators and students think they've been testing for civic knowledge, but they're not really testing for it at all. There are only 4 states that actually give extensive written tests for civic education. Some of these are very good written tests. They can assess civic knowledge quite well, but civic knowledge is only part of the field of civic preparation. These tests generally do not adequately assess civic skills, civic experiences, civic dispositions. And that's why the conclusion we reached in our report was to adequately and fairly assess civic readiness, we really need to look to authentic assessments, to performance measures, and that is the subject for tonight's webinar. We want to explore what is the state of our knowledge and our experience with performance assessment in the area of civic readiness. Fortunately, we have 3 of the country's leading thinkers and practitioners who are doing cutting-edge work in this area of developing authentic assessments for civic education and for other areas. But we're focusing on civic education. Without any further ado, let me introduce these 3 individuals to you. First is David Kidd, who is the Chief Assessment Scientist with the Design Studio at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Currently, Dr. Kidd leads research studies with the Democratic Knowledge Project and the National Ethics Project that are run by that institute. David received a PhD in social psychology from the New School of Social Research in 2015, where he was a postdoctoral fellow before coming to Harvard in 2017. Next is Phyllis Tashlik, who directs the Center for Inquiry in Teaching and Learning, which provides, that's in New York State, her center provides professional development support for teachers within the New York State Performance Standards Consortium. The consortium is a system of 28 public high schools around New York State who serve over 12,000 students. And consortium member schools have a waiver that allows them to graduate students using a performance assessment system in place of most of the New York State Regents exams. As director of the center, Phyllis has helped to design and implement the consortium's performance assessment system. Finally, is Margarita Olivera-Aguilar, who is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research. Margarita's research interests include the measurement of educational and psychological constructs, the evaluation of fairness in assessments, social, emotional, and civic learning, cultural responsive education, and closing opportunity gaps. Before joining AIR, Dr. Olivera-Aguilar was a research scientist at the Education Testing Service for 8 years, and she was an assistant professor at the National University Autonomous of Mexico. She earned her PhD and MA in quantitative psychology from Arizona State University. So welcome to all of you. And I'd like to begin our discussion by first reading, I think, a very apt definition of what performance assessment exactly is. This comes from Linda Darling-Hammond. Many of you know her. She's a former distinguished professor from the Stanford School of Education. Dr. Darling-Hammond says that performance assessments are a type of authentic assessment that, quote, allows students to construct or perform an original response rather than just recognizing a potentially right answer out of a list provided, and that can measure students' cognitive thinking and reasoning skills and their ability to apply knowledge to solve realistic, meaningful problems. End quote. So proponents of authentic assessment often use combinations of portfolios, performances, self-reflection, simulations, and project-based activities to assess student competence in particular areas. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to discuss their work they're doing and the extent to which they may be making use of some of these different types of performance assessment. But before doing that, I just wonder if each of you could give us a very concise answer to the question of why are performance assessments especially appropriate for the area of civics, which is what our topic for tonight is. David, why don't we start with you?
Sure. That's a great question. And I want to start with a caveat that I don't think that all assessment has to be performance assessment in civics, but I do think that in the context of civic education, performance assessments make a lot of sense. Two reasons really stand out to me. The first is that civics doesn't always lend itself to clear-cut, correct answers in terms of outcomes. History is full of people who tried and failed and failed and failed and failed and then eventually succeeded at something. But even then, their success is often contested by people with different values and beliefs. So what that means is that we often have to look at the process. Are people pursuing their civic goals, whatever they are, in a way that sustains the democracy and adheres to some basic guidelines for pursuing civic goals responsibly? So in that sense, performance assessment just gives us a direct insight into sort of how people are going about civics. The other reason I think is that, and it's connected to the first reason, is that we just don't know often what the best strategy is, even when we've identified, a particular goal. The civic landscape is always changing. And so there just needs to be some flexibility built in for learners of all different backgrounds to pursue authentic civic goals when we're doing assessments. So just basically, civics is a little too complicated, I think, to arrive at clear-cut right or wrong answers. And so we really have to see people do civics to see how they're doing.
Okay, so Phyllis, would you basically agree with David's perceptions about the importance of performance measures for civics? Oh, I think you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. I'm coming from a long and deep experience with performance assessment. So I was really struck last night. I heard Chancellor King on your webinar as part of Civics Week, and he said, he said, civics happens in every classroom, and that is so true. I don't see civics as something that is separate from everything else that goes on in a classroom or in a school. And you need the kind of culture that that really values student voice. You need a kind of culture that gives students a sense of agency, that they can do things, that they matter, that the assessments and the tasks that they're given are authentic to them, have meaning for them, and that their opinion matters. And I think all of that is what performance assessment supports. So the experience that students are getting in their classrooms, that they're getting day by day by day, are the same experiences that carry over to anything that we want to label civics. I don't think civics is a separate class, a separate course, or your weekly visit to your local city council person. I see civics as really part of the whole education. And you mentioned democracy. This is the basis of our democracy as well. And it has to be something that's part of what students are experiencing at young ages, and certainly when they're in high school and questioning things and need the tools for thinking critically about it. And so I see it as part of all of that.
Oh, okay, very insightful. Appreciate that. Margarita, do you agree with those perspectives, or would you like to add anything to them?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with what David and Phyllis said. I think civics is a lot about engaging with a community. It's a lot about empowering, how empowered we are as citizens. It is about questioning what we are listening on the news. And I think, as Phyllis was saying, there is a lot of variability on what people care about and how they interact with their communities. And I think it's really hard to get at this flexibility through standardized assessments, multiple choice assessments. There are innovative ways to do it. And I think the field is thinking in ways in which we can incorporate that flexibility, but it is hard. So I think that performance-based assessments allow for this flexibility and are more attuned to what civics really is.
Okay, well, thank you all. That was a very great way to start off our conversation. But now I'd like to ask each of you to tell us, give us a brief summary of what it is that the institutions you're working at, the projects you're working on, are actually doing as far as research and practice in the field of performance assessment in civics. And David, we'll start with you again.
Sure. So I have had a great opportunity to work with the Democratic Knowledge Project, which is based at the Edmund and Lily Saffer Center for Ethics at Harvard University. And it's a group that was started by Professor Danielle Allen in 2017, in 2018 to respond to new legislation in Massachusetts that called for mandatory 8th grade civics course in Massachusetts, and also called for all students in Massachusetts to complete a student-led civics project, both in 8th grade and then once in high school. And recognizing the power of this legislation, our team wanted to make sure that educators had the tools they needed to deliver a full year 8th grade civics curriculum. And so we worked with educators to build that curriculum. And along the way, we also realized that we needed to develop assessments as well. And so we have developed an assessment toolkit that includes as one component a performance-based assessment that's really built around the mandated student-led civics project. The civics projects in Massachusetts are not part of an assessment system on their own, but at the Democratic Knowledge Project, we really saw that as a perfect opportunity to hold ourselves accountable as curriculum designers to see, are students actually able to do civics after they learn all of the philosophical foundations and the history and engage with, different perspectives through the media and practice discerning accurate sources and constructing arguments. We wanted to see, are they actually able to identify something they care about in their community, and then figure out why it would matter to other people and identify levers of power to bring about change, to achieve their goals. And so that's sort of where we see the gold standard evidence is can these learners actually take on a civic role? And so for us, the performance-based assessment seemed absolutely critical if we're going to be serious about holding ourselves accountable. So we've developed a checklist based assessment that asks students to reflect on key elements of the design of their student-led civics project and tell us about it. And then educators are equipped with a checklist to identify key features in their responses. And we've been testing this in some studies to see if we can get adequate inter-rater reliability and things like that, correlations with other scores. But one of the key things we want to do is have a system where the students decide what the project is. So it's a performance-based assessment that's based on actually doing civics. So that's what we've been doing in that area.
That sounds terrific. And now, Phyllis, you've been doing this. You and the Standard Space Consortium in New York State have been in this area for decades, as I understand it. So how did you get started, and how has this work progressed?
Oh, well, we got started in the late 90s when we were given the opportunity to explore other ways of doing assessment. It was part of the Commissioner Tom Sobel's idea, where he believed on a top-down support for bottom-up reform. And we were given the valuable time and space to really develop this and work with schools on this. Yes, we're in our 26th year now, and the schools have collaborated on what do we mean by performance assessment? How do we use that in the classroom? How do we develop systems that nurture teacher professionalism? Because the commitment of the teachers is so important to the work that goes on. And you had mentioned at the beginning, we had 28 schools. We actually have 38 schools that are now part of the consortium, including 36 schools in New York City and a school in Ithaca, New York, and a school in Rochester, New York. And just of late, the SED has expressed interest in it's called PLAN, and they are looking at ways to support other schools throughout the state who would be interested in performance assessment. And our model was one of the basis for the beginning of plan and showing what we've done and what we've accomplished through that.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you a little more about the methods that you use in a few minutes, but first I wanted to turn to Margarita, whose particular research interests I know in the area of cultural responsiveness, and you've been doing some really cutting-edge thinking and research on how we can really respond to the equity needs of these kinds of exams. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Margarita?
Yeah, so this is work that I started back at ETS. And what we were doing was to really think about what it means to have culturally responsive assessments. There is a lot of work on culturally responsive education and pedagogy, but the translation to assessments is probably not as clear. So what we did was to review all this literature on culturally responsive education and try to extract the most important principles that could be applied to assessments. And we have a report that I'm happy to share. And in this report, we talk about 5 principles. So one is empowering the community, students and teachers in the assessment process. Another one is including flexibility in how students are being assessed. Another one is engagement. Assessments should be engaging for students. The 4th one is rigor. We have to make sure that we are not lowering expectations for students. And the final one is to have an asset perspective. So instead of talking about what students cannot do, we have to highlight the things that they can do. So that is work that I started at ETS, and now at AIR, as part, we have a new center on advancing measurement and assessment. And we also have, we are building our portfolio on civic learning. And we're trying to incorporate those principles in the assessments that we are producing. We partner at AIR, we partner with civic curriculum developers. And there is always the need when we do program evaluation to have really good measures of civic learning. So as part of that work, we're trying to build these assessments considering this framework of culturally responsive education. For example, one of the things that we're doing is thinking about assessments that get not only at civic readiness, but also at indicators of opportunity to learn. What are those opportunities that students have in school to learn civics, and how those opportunities differ by important variables? For example, the geographic location of the schools, the SES of schools, and other variables.
Okay, so Phyllis, I want to get back to you and probe a little bit more into the methods that the consortium has been using over the years. To what extent do you incorporate some of these equity principles that Margarita just outlined? For instance, incorporating the participation of teachers and students in the development of the assessments and how they go forward. Can you speak a little about that?
Yeah, it's interesting that when the state began this work on plan, performance-based learning assessment, and they did a study of 12 states, 12 of the states that were engaged in some form of performance assessment, and then they did a more intensive case study of 5 states. And one thing that was very clear in the report is how important it is to have a locally based project. As Margarita was talking about the community, the involvement of the teachers in the creation of the performance assessment, the engagement of the students, and so that idea of being very locally based is really part of what we do, because we say we are teacher designed, student focused, and externally assessed. And the assessments that that we use grow out of the classroom. So they're not imposed on the classroom. They are relevant to what students have been studying, and what they've been studying, often incorporates student choice, recognition of the cultural experiences that they've had, their strong interests, and the tasks evolve out of that. We've been able to develop rubrics and for the assessments. All of that comes out of the professional development, comes out of the work of the teachers. They have a collaborative basis for all of this. And I mentioned that we have 38 schools. So we are a network of those 38 schools where there's a lot of sharing. There's a lot of pooling of curriculum, of visiting each other's classrooms. And so all of this is very integrated. I call it an infrastructure for the assessment system.
Okay, that sounds terrific. So David, I think you started telling us a bit of how teacher-focused and student-focused input is critical to the way you go about things. I wonder if you can explain a little more the equity implications of how this process works out with the Democratic Knowledge Project.
Sure. And I want to seize on something that Phyllis discussed, which was the ways in which they align the assessments with what students are locally learning and doing, so that people are getting tested on what they've actually been taught. And the core principle, one of the core principles motivating our assessment work was that we should have assessments that are derived from the curriculum. So we have state standards, and state standards in Massachusetts, I assume pretty much everywhere, there are a lot of things in those standards, and it's hard for but they don't give you a curriculum, right? So teachers, educators at different levels have to figure out, how are we going to meet these standards? They have to interpret the standards. They're going to have to make some choices about what things to really go for in depth. And so there's that puts people in a difficult position if a separate group is looking at the standards and designing an assessment around those standards. So then there's this guessing game. Am I the educator interpreting the standards and making choices about the standards in the same way that the assessment designer is making those choices? And that can lead to educators, students, parents, stakeholders across the board being worried about matching the representation of the standards that is going to end up on the test they take. So to get around that, we thought, well, let's design a curriculum that's really well aligned with the state standards. Let's do that working with educators in the schools, that we want to work in across the state of Massachusetts. Hear from them what works, have them help us design the curriculum. We have brought in students to help in the curriculum design work. We rely a lot on the teachers to get that sort of input. And on the assessment side, we have done more limited work with students. It was hard to recruit students to participate in a research study on assessment design. But we did hear from some, and they helped us, make sure that we were asking questions that mattered to them, and ask the questions in ways that they understood what we were actually asking them to tell us. So we did a lot of work on the assessment side to basically make it hard for us to miss evidence of student learning if it was there. And we did that by making sure that we were assessing not just what was being taught, but assessing in ways that were consistent with how students were being taught. Now, this works because the curriculum is aligned with the state standards. It's a high quality curriculum. So there is a sense that we don't see it being a problem if teachers teach to the test, if the test is really well designed. So, our big test, the thing we really want to see is students do the student-led civics projects. we're totally fine with teachers seeing that as, and students seeing that as like, we need to do well on that test, because that means they're going to do well at civics. So we have done a lot of work with teachers. And I want to just emphasize that we've done work across the state, and Massachusetts is homogenous in some regards, but there is a lot of diversity there. We have rural areas that are more conservative. We have more urban areas that are, you know, very liberal, a full mix. And so we try to work with all of those groups meaningfully.
Okay, well, I want to pick up David's last point and ask Margarita a kind of pointed question. And I don't know if you've had experience with this, but when you talk about a wide state like Massachusetts with a broad, diverse population, how do you respond to the need for cultural responsiveness when the state has to test people from a broad range of communities? I guess this is the kind of question that you wrestle with in the research you're doing. But how can those responsible for assessment on a statewide level build cultural responsiveness into the test?
I think that is a great question, and I don't think I have great answers. I think it's really hard. So one of the principles that we emphasize is involving the community in the assessment development process. And this means involving them even in defining what is civic learning. Like, what is it that they care about in civic learning? Because different communities may care about different things. And if you find that that's the case, then an assessment gets really complicated, right? Because civics could mean very different things for different populations. Another thing that I have encountered is also there are different cultural values. So, for example, people from some communities that have more interdependent cultures and are very attuned to what others think, they may be less willing to express their opinions about what an assessment should look like, in comparison to other cultures where it is very common to do this, right? Like where people are constantly encouraged to express their opinions and be very assertive. So just by having those cultural differences, it becomes really hard to engage the community in these definitions of the construct and creating items. Also thinking about if we want to involve parents from low SES communities, well, maybe they don't have as much flexibility for like leaving their jobs and spending an hour or two with researchers. So it's very complicated. I'm not saying this is easy, and I think this is why not a lot of people are doing it. But there are a lot of approaches. I think there is a lot that we can learn from participatory research approaches. I think there is a lot that we can learn from those things. But I think the other important thing is to monitor the consequences of these approaches, because as I was saying, it is ideal that and this is just an example of the 5 principles that we have. It is ideal that we engage the community in every step of the process. But as I was saying, there may be some communities that are less willing or less used to express their opinions. And if that's the case, they may end up being underrepresented, like their values or the things they care about in civics, they may end up being underrepresented in the assessment. And that creates an issue for the validity of the assessment, the reliability of the assessment for these specific populations. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Michael, I don't think I have great answers, but for anyone interested in doing more research, this is a great area of research because there are more questions than answers.
Right. Well, I'm going to put Phyllis on the spot because she not only does research, but she's working with 38 schools to put them into practice. Have you been able to deal with this question of diversity and cultural responsiveness among the schools in your network, Phyllis?
Yeah, I think we have some interesting experiences and examples for people, because we are such a large network, and yet we've been going strong for 25 years. And I think it's that balance between what we can all agree on and then the flexibility to allow each school and each school community the latitude that they require to, because of who their students are, who their teachers are, the community where they're located. So we have certain, I mentioned the rubrics before, that is something that unites all of us. And it's because it's created by the teachers, and we created, what I'm calling locally within our network. It's something that we can change also. If we're not reaching the students in the ways that we think are productive, we can go back, we can amend them, we can readjust them, and then it goes out to the whole community. When I say we, I mean all of the schools and the teachers. So, and we have certain subject areas that the core academic courses that we have rubrics for, but then we also allow schools to add on other rubrics in other areas that they might consider very important. For example, the arts or art criticism, second languages. So it's that balance between what we all share and commit to, and then where we have latitude for each of the different communities. We also share our curricula, and although we have schools located in the poorest zip codes of the country, we also have schools that have some middle class student body. We have schools in urban areas. We have schools upstate New York. So, but there are certain things that go beyond that and that students find interesting and challenging. So it's highly diverse, and yet we have a unity at the same time.
Okay, I saw David kind of nodding his head at some of the points that Margarita was making earlier on. So David, I think you've got something to tell us about how cultural responsiveness and diversity are worked out within the schools that you're working with.
Sure. I think my most enthusiastic nods were when Margarita was saying that it's very hard and there's not an obvious answer to this problem and more work needs to be done. So I just want to emphasize that I don't think we've, cracked this nut at the Democratic Knowledge Project. I think that we're one of many groups working hard on this problem. But I will say that, and actually hearing Phyllis and Margarita both talk about it made me realize that, I should be clear that we actually do kind of impose a particular vision of civic identity development. So we aren't actually asking educators or community members to define all of the outcomes that we're assessing. Now, what we have done is we've been very explicit and disciplined about presenting that theory of civic identity development and what we see as the key goals of our curriculum. So, we're not tailoring the curriculum for specific schools. What we've done is develop a curriculum that we think is relevant across the state. It's aligned with the standards. There's a coherent theory of civic development behind it. So people are welcome to dig into that. But I'll also say that we've developed, curriculum that is like 80% complete. So there is an idea that educators are going to have to adjust and modify to make things relevant to their students. And I'll just give one concrete example. When we talk about the Bill of Rights, we find that in some schools that are sort of higher SES, more middle class, we see that students are really into First Amendment stuff. Like they get it. When we're working in schools that are more under-resourced, where there are often more problems in the community with, say, law enforcement, people gravitate more towards the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. Those are really relevant to them. And so that's the thing is like, well, every student needs to learn about the Bill of Rights. And they should learn about all of them. But where you do the deep dive is going to depend, not just on the school actually, but even the students, right? So we build in this flexibility at the classroom level, but also on the student level for people to identify what matters to them. So there's built-in flexibility there that really has to be embraced by educators for the curriculum to work. And by virtue, sort of the assessments that we have developed are really built on the premise that students are going to be choosing their topics. And their teachers are probably in the best position to gauge whether or not those topics are sort of authentic to the students than we would be by saying everybody has to do a First Amendment project or something, which some students might be like, well, that would be cool, but yeah.
That's a great concrete.
So Michael, I'd like to give an example of like a course that is shared by many of our schools, but has a kind of flexibility to the students and the teacher. It's called Looking for an Argument. And it's about arguing, and it's about backing up your opinion with relevant evidence, evaluating the evidence that you're gathering, which is especially important because of all that goes on to the internet, as students understand it's not always true. And the students choose the arguments that they want to focus on, and it's a process of reading different articles, hearing teachers debate some of the different points of view, writing papers about it. So it has a format and a content, but it also has that flexibility where even in the same school, you might have different classrooms using it in different ways, but it's providing the kind of critical thinking that I think is the basis of just about everything we can talk about in civics education.
Yeah, actually, this discussion is leading me to understand that civics is almost, if it's done right, good civics, if I'll pick up John King's phrase from yesterday, it really does emphasize cultural responsiveness. I mean, in New York, we emphasize capstone projects with the SEAL projects that are being done in 500 of our schools, and students get to choose the project they want to work on, and it's something that is meaningful to them. So it's just naturally culturally responsive, and I see I'm getting affirmative nods from all three of our panelists. All right, so much for summing up that part of the discussion. Margarita, I'd like to go back to you because I know one of the 5 pillars for culturally responsive, authentic assessment that you emphasize is flexibility, and all of you talked about flexibility. So that's one of the great advantages of performance assessment, obviously, and we've been talking for this entire conversation about the virtues of allowing teachers, students to respond in the way that's meaningful and authentic to them. But the other part of the equation that most people are concerned about when they think of authentic assessment and performance assessment is how can we assure the validity and the objectivity of the outcomes that are being assessed when there's so much flexibility going on. And I'll put you on the spot first again, Margarita, if you don't mind. How do you balance the flexibility that you emphasize in your research with psychometric validation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think with no great answers yet. So I think I want to start differentiating between reliability and validity really quickly, because I think there are a lot of implications of flexibility in both of these concepts. So thinking about reliability, which is the accuracy in what we are measuring, right? Like if we could measure the same thing over and over again, we want to get kind of similar results each time. And validity is about the evidence we have about the claims we are making on the assessment. So if we are saying that this assessment really helps us understand which students can graduate from high school, that is very different as saying we can use this assessment to evaluate teachers, for example. So when we do validity studies, we have to collect a lot of evidence that can justify those claims that we're trying to make. Now, I think that depending on those claims, that is where we can think about the flexibility in validity and reliability, right? If we're using an assessment for high stakes decision, like which students get into college, then I think we have to be extremely careful with the changes that we make in the assessment to allow for flexibility. And we have to build a lot of studies. We have to conduct a lot of studies to have evidence for those claims. Now, there are other assessments in which we can have more flexibility, right? But I think it's a tricky thing. I think we have to be very careful and conduct a lot of studies. And I think in my mind, I think there are two issues with flexibility. So when I think about flexibility in the sense that students choose a topic or choose a way of demonstrating their knowledge, I'm thinking that then it's probably what they are choosing. It's not only about demonstrating their knowledge, it also shows their interests, right? It also shows their writing skills. If they are going to demonstrate this knowledge in an essay, it shows how much access to information they have, how much support. So instead of being an assessment of only civics, it becomes an assessment of many other things. So it gets a little tricky because validity, the traditional view of thinking about validity is whether we are measuring what we are saying we're measuring. And when you have all these other things influencing students' responses, then I think it takes more effort in conducting, in building a validity argument. And the other thing that I'm very wary of is that when we allow all of this flexibility on the student's part in choosing how to demonstrate their knowledge, I worry about the implications in the cognitive load of choosing. What about those students who maybe haven't had a chance to make a lot of these kind of decisions in the past, and they may be overwhelmed with the idea of choosing how to be evaluated or being evaluated and maybe not being able to know what's the best way to demonstrate their knowledge? They may be choosing a topic that maybe doesn't have a lot of meat to explore, or a topic that is not of interest to the teacher. Of course, there's like the issue of like having a good rubric, but there are a lot of things at play in this choice situation. And I know like there's a lot of research in psychology and behavioral economics showing us that humans, we're not very good at choosing. So I think it's like one of those things that I don't think it's impossible. I just think that we have to be very careful when building these assessments that are more flexible and really conducting studies to build the validity argument that we can make the claims that we are making with the assessment.
Okay, well, David, let me turn to you. How do you balance these issues of flexibility and validity, reliability in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I just want to say that I strongly agree with everything Margarita said there, particularly about the sort of distinction between reliability, and validity of the sense that you could have a very reliable instrument, say a temperature gauge, but that isn't going to tell you whether or not it's a nice day outside, right? Because it's just one dimension. It doesn't account for whether or not you like cold weather or hot weather. But it's very reliable. It's just not very valid. Doesn't have a lot of meaning to it on its own. And I think that what does happen in assessment is that we try to get reliability as a precondition for validity. And sometimes what that can do is it tends to push us to narrow the construct a lot. And in the context of civics, like some of the really important constructs of, coming up with a strategy to address a pressing problem, it's hard to get at a single correct answer there. And so what can end up happening is you end up simplifying the scenario so much that you sort of force people into a right answer, but then you lose all of that authenticity and flexibility that Phyllis and Margarita and I have been talking about. So the trade-off is real. There is a cost. But I think that we also have to sort of step back and ask, like, why are we assessing? And Margarita touched on this is if we're doing assessment so that we can rank students and distinguish between a score of 73 versus 70, so that one person gets into one college and the other person goes to another college. If we're trying to do that in civics, I would just sort of encourage us to pause and think about it, because really what the entrance exam is for our democracy. And at the end of the day, everybody is going to be a member of this democracy, or should have that opportunity. So in that sense, this country has a pretty nasty history of literacy tests and things like that. I don't think we really want to be in the business of ranking, especially 8th graders, and having them see civics as a competition where they can be better than someone else. I think we have to get back to the idea of political equality and think, what does that mean for assessment? And I think that, and Margarita was talking about this too, that if we're using assessment to hold ourselves as educators accountable, we really need reliability at the group level more than the individual level, right? We need to know, are we actually providing an equal civic education across the board? Is it high quality? Rather than figuring out, okay, is this particular student better than this other student? And I think that just in the context of civic education, that raises a host of sort of philosophical questions about what it means to live in a constitutional democracy of political equals. So to say that, I think we need assessment for accountability, for sure. But I think that we care more about validity of having a future where people can actively operate our government, rather than reliability so that we have discrete numbers we can work with. So that's where
you're reminding me, in one of our prior conversations, you gave me an example, a really concrete example that I think well illustrates what you're talking about. And that's when you were talking about the self-reflection process that you've encouraged students to go through, where you design the questions. If I understood this correctly, you work with teachers to design questions to which there are only right answers. No matter what the student says, it's going to bring out a deep knowledge of civics. Can you just elaborate on that a little more?
Sure. So what we do, and I want to point out too, this gets to the question of sort of cognitive load and can students do this? And I just want to say that not in an hour. This is the student-led civics project it's a year-long effort. And so students are grappling with these issues. They're identifying their values early on, thinking about what issues connect to that. It takes time. And so that's another thing. We just have to expand what we think of as the test in terms of its time frame. And so what the questions in our performance-based assessment really are about is bringing out from students that work they had done previously. So they're reflecting on it. So, one example there might be one of the items is after students have identified an issue that matters to them, we ask them, why would this matter to other people? And there are lots of reasons people could give for that. But what we're really looking for is there evidence that they thought about why other people should care about this, how to build a coalition, because that's the work of democracy. So there's this idea that if students are, they see these questions before they start their project, they know what the assessment looks like. They know how they're going to be, quote unquote, graded. And that's the trick, because if they have answers to these questions, we know they've tried, that they've actually gone through the process of taking civic action. Maybe not with resounding success, but they've had that practice and they've had a chance to reflect on that practice.
Oh, that's terrific. Okay, so Phyllis, we've gotten to the stage of talking about grading, and from what I know of how the consortium actually assesses students, you built in a way of balancing flexibility and validity by using both internal teachers who know the student and their work, and you bring in outside evaluators. Can you explain a little to our audience exactly how that works?
Yeah, and I also want to go back to the question about validity and reliability.
Okay, whichever order you'd like to answer.
Well, you know, I started off talking about civics happens in every classroom. So, and you know, and that means your literature classroom, your science classroom, you know, classrooms where you are being asked to think deeply, to be critical, to analyze, to exchange ideas, to look at multiple points of view. I see all of that as part of civics. So we've shown we have content validity. We have shown, so earlier David had talked about state standards, which can go on and on and on. But we've shown that the content of our different courses and the content of the tasks that we ask and the content of the texts that our students read, that we are meeting state standards, and that we are, in fact, sometimes doing so in a multidisciplinary way. For example, even in our math class, our math assessments, students are writing. So we're also meeting ELA standards at the same time. So we have content validity, and we have something called predictive validity, because we are showing that we are accomplishing what we set out to do, which is to improve graduation rates, to improve college enrollment. And so we can predict from what we're doing that we are meeting those criteria as well. As far as reliability, when we began this, we worked with psychometricians because we wanted to, David talked about sorting. We are, you know, the antithesis of ranking and sorting students. And so we wanted to develop something that was reliable, but that wasn't falling into that rigidity of a sorting system. And what we do, we have, it's kind of a redundancy. So we have a stage where students are choosing the topics that they're going to explore in their graduation tasks. And we and students write papers. They write papers across the curriculum, English, science, math, social studies, and they are evaluated on those papers, not only by their own subject area teacher, but by another teacher also in that field. And they are using, as I mentioned earlier, the same consortium rubric, which all consortium teachers have committed to, adapted, changed, and used in their classrooms. Then students go on, we talked about having multiple ways to express learning. Again, looking for ways to avoid that rigidity. And so students also meet with an external evaluator, someone who is not their classroom teacher, and they talk about their paper, they talk about their ideas, they talk about why they chose that subject area, what it means to them, and they're able to really expound on it and have an adult discussion, analysis, back and forth between the student and the external evaluator, so that the assessment is also a learning experience. And I think that's what's really important about performance assessment. It's not just an assessment tool, it's a learning experience as well. And so at the end of some experience like that, students are, you know, they're beaming, like they feel really good about themselves, and they've gone through this enlightening experience for them, where they may even go deeper than their paper initially. And so they have that experience of learning again. So that's, so we've taken the psychometric tools of validity and reliability and used it in a very productive, supportive, and creative way, I think.
Okay, you know, what I'm getting out of these really interesting responses that all three of you gave is that good assessment for civics is high stakes assessment of a rare type. It's high stakes for democracy, not so much high stakes for whether kids get into this college or that college along their way. Okay, we're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask our panel one last question before we do. And that is, do you see the potential for implementing this approach to authentic assessment that we've been talking about, that you guys have been pioneering? You see implementing this on a large scale basis? This is a real issue for us in New York State now, because our regents are looking for new ways to approach graduation requirements, and they may be rethinking their century-old written exams in all areas. Civics would seem to be a great area for them to explore and expand. You think we can do it on a statewide basis? Well, I guess you're doing it to some extent on a statewide basis already in Massachusetts, David, so maybe I should start with you to respond to that question.
Yeah. Aspirationally in Massachusetts, we work with a number of schools who use our curriculum and assessment toolkit, and we've just this year released the curriculum after years of development publicly. So it's available for free to use at our website, democraticknowledgeproject.org. You know, we don't know how many schools will pick it up. We have goals, but it's not fully statewide. I will say, though, that one of the core concerns in designing the assessment was that it be practical to use. And that means that teachers can use it with minimal training and achieve tolerable levels of inter-rater reliability such that the scores are not random. It's a higher bar than that, but you know, we want to have meaningful reliability, but really to empower classroom teachers to do the assessment themselves. Now, obviously, there are issues there around, like, teachers could just say, "Oh, my students are great," but because there is a set checklist, it is possible to audit this and things like that. But the real challenge, I think, is making space in the school year for students to do meaningful work. So we're lucky in Massachusetts that the state mandates the student-led civics projects. At the same time, there will be a standardized civics assessment in the state. And I am fairly confident that if the student-led civics projects were not mandated by the state, teachers wouldn't feel confident dedicating a lot of time to student-led civics projects if they didn't feel that that was going to be on the test. And students might also be asking, is this going to be on the test? And so I think in order for at least the performance-based assessment, you know, we've been working on the DKP, for that to work, you have to have top-down support, not just for the assessment, but for the learning activities that are worth assessing. So this is just a shift from seeing assessment as something that happens in a proctored room with a timer and anxiety levels high, to seeing assessment as measuring, you know, observing and interpreting meaningful behavior. And sometimes that takes time. And so that's why it's really important. I mean, I am not advocating let's take up 6 weeks for standardized testing. I'm saying if we can give people a really good assessment activity that is a learning activity, as Phyllis was mentioning, then we do the assessment sort of add-on, in the sense that, like, the students don't feel like they're doing a test, they're doing a civics project. We do the assessment by interpreting what they do. So we're not taking up learning time for testing time. But again, that's a luxury. You know, states need to make that space for students to do this sort of work, I think, for it to happen.
Okay. So Phyllis,
I have to add a cautionary note here. um, you can't have two different systems. Well, I don't think you can have two different systems of assessment working at the same time. And what David mentioned about, it's suddenly, well, is this going to be on the test? It's teaching to the test, learning to the test. That is going to dominate if you're trying to do both of these things at the same time. And a real performance assessment, civics, or any area that you're studying is very time intensive, and allowing students to have choice is very time intensive. It goes back to what Margarita said. You have to make sure the students' choices are good choices also. You don't want a student to spend a whole lot of time on something that isn't really going to be as productive as it could be. And it is such a different kind of system from a standardized test situation that having two at a time just doesn't work. And they found that to be true up in New Hampshire when they had, I don't go into too much detail, but for a while they had more performance-based types of activities. And when the new administration came in, they started to impose more top-down standardized testing. And it just phased out a lot of the performance-based assessments. It's the bully in the room. And so I just think it's a cautionary note that we have to.
Very, very good thing to make us keep in mind. So Margarita, do you have any thoughts about implementing performance assessment in civics, at least on a statewide basis?
I wonder about how AI can help us with these efforts, because so in two ways. So one of the probably harder things to do in performance-based assessments, there are many things, I don't know if this is the hardest, but it's really hard to score these projects, right? If they are essays, so whatever they are, it's really hard. And there are issues about rater reliability, and also the rater's perspectives, and all these other things. And AI tools, LLMs, are getting really, really good. And we can train them to help us score those essays or projects. So that is one area where I am curious to see whether we can make improvements there. And the other one is that, as Phyllis was talking about, how students make choices and how it is time consuming to help them think through their choices and reflect on whether there could be something else that could benefit them in the project. I was also thinking that in the future, it would be great to see LLMs helping students interact in this way. I imagine having an LLM asking a student, why did you choose this? And how are you planning to address this part of the rubric of your assessment? So I think AI could help us improve assessments, make them more efficient. But I'm also aware of the concerns of AI, because as we can use AI to facilitate the implementation of these assessments. Students are also going to be using them for their projects, and we have to think about how to control for that, how to incorporate students' use of AI in the projects themselves. So it's just an idea, and I'm very interested in this topic of the use of AI in assessments.
Actually, I want to turn to the questions now, although we don't have time for too many questions. But one of them was, when you spoke about AI, will the growing use of AI make widespread implementation of performance assessment more likely? Are people going to turn more to performance assessment? I guess this is getting to teachers being somewhat concerned that when they have written exams, people are getting their information, getting their answers from the AI printouts. Anybody
So,
want to into that?
yeah, I had mentioned previously that we embrace multiple ways of expressing learning. And so having that oral discussion between a student and an evaluator, I mean, that happens in real time between 2 or 3 people. So it's not AI dictated. It's really a chance to explore ideas. It allows for nuance. It allows for subtlety. It allows for a creative exchange where ideas grow between people discussing something. So I see that as probably getting more and more recognition as an important factor in assessment.
Okay, let's turn to a second question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just had one sort of thing about the use of particularly large language models in civics assessment. I would be really concerned about what language was going into that large model. So a lot of the AI that we encounter is based on, corpuses of the internet. And I just don't know what it would look like if we had an AI trained on, say, a platform like Twitter, and what it would learn about politics and whether or not we would want that. Because I mean, all these models do is they identify patterns and trends, what's the norm, which is why when you use something like ChatGPT, you get a generic response. We don't want generic responses from students in civics. What we want is them to do something authentic. And so in that sense, I feel like if we're doing civics assessment right, it's going to be hard and boring for students to use AI to come up with their answers. It'll also probably stand out to educators if they do. But I just, the other concern I would have is that if we do use AI in this space, I think we need to be very, very careful about what data goes into that model. So I just wanted to put that out as a caution.
Okay, let me turn to another question. One of our viewers asked, how does performance assessment change instructional content? Will teachers be able to cover the curriculum? Okay, Phyllis, you were nodding. Let you answer that.
You have to choose between depth and breadth. You can't do both. And yes, a performance assessment it's a deep dive into something. You will not have the breadth of American History 101. You will have, intensive investigation into, David mentioned law. We have a constitutional law class. It's an entire semester. It's not a week in American history. It's, an entire semester. So yes, you will sacrifice some of that breadth, but you will get, you will learn how to learn when you can really go deeply into something.
Okay, next question we have. Somebody wanted to know how civic content is currently assessed by the New York State Regents exams and what people thought about it. Well, I'm going to begin by answering that question because I know we studied it in our civics overview, our assessment overview. There are a limited number of questions about civics in the overall social studies exam in New York. That's typical of many states. And what we discovered is most of the so-called civics questions were asking about government relations historically from the World War II era or whatever. It was not really the kind of current civics we're talking about. So the second part of that question that I won't answer, but I'll see if one of you would like to, is what do you think of that? Is it sufficient to test civic knowledge, which a good test can do, as only a part of a social studies examination, the way New York and many other states do now? Anybody want to answer that? If not, we'll go to the next question. All right, we don't have to.
I can provide a somewhat something of an answer. It just reminds me of years ago when we wanted to develop curriculum, LGBTQ curriculum. And I was looking for ways to get some funding so that we could work with teachers and do all the work that required. And it was very hard to get funding. And someone, more than once I heard, well, are there any questions on the Regents exam about that? And I said, no, that's not the reason to develop curriculum, in LGBTQ studies. So, I think, again, it shows the limitations of trying to look at civics and groups' rights and culture in a standardized testing situation.
Yeah, I think that question is a good way of rounding out what we've been talking about for the last hour and a quarter, which is you need authentic assessment, you need performance assessment, because you can't squeeze enough material into a written test or even a part of a written test, which is the way New York and many other states do it now. Okay, the last question.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just feel that the need to do this, because I agree that we need authentic assessments, but I also think that assessments of knowledge are really important, and I think we could be doing a better job at that. I am a citizen, a naturalized citizen, and I do think that I wasn't educated in a curriculum that taught me about the US government and US history and all these other things. And I do think that learning those things is really important for making me a good citizen. So I'm not saying that's the only thing we should be assessing. I just want to highlight the importance of also assessing that.
Yes, and I didn't mean to say that. A good written test can ask probing questions, certainly about civic knowledge. And there are a number of states that do a good job. New York does not do a good job because it's not a test that's focused on civics. It's social studies, and they squeeze in a few civics questions among mostly history, geography, economics, etc. In any event, I think we have actually run out of time, and won't get to the last question or two from the audience, but this has been a really fascinating and I think very substantive session. I'm going to look forward to reviewing the video when it comes out and being able to take notes, which I couldn't while I was moderating this, on a lot of the words of wisdom that all three of you have shared with us. So we really want to thank you so much. I mean, you people have done such great thinking and acting out in a good sense of how you can start to put these principles into practice. And we're all very much in your debt for that. I wanted to also, while I'm giving thanks, acknowledge our funders at Democracy Ready, which are the Hewlett Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the Einhorn Collaborative. And I also have to thank some of our staff members here at the Center for Educational Equity, especially Jessica Wolf, Nan Mead, and Katie Luce, who have done yeoman service in putting together this webinar and the other 4 or 5 webinars we're running during this Civic Learning Week.